Welcome to our coverage of the autumn statement. George Osborne, the Chancellor, has just delivered his plans for taxation and spending, and the Shadow Chancellor Ed Balls has given his riposte. With me to discuss the implications are the FT's economics editor, Giles, and the FT's political columnist, Janan. Chris, if I could start with you. The Chancellor said here that he's not making a giveaway this year. Is that true?
It is true. I mean, we've only just got the numbers, so this is broadly how they work. There are some small giveaways. The stamp duty change, getting rid of the slab structure, gives away about $1 billion because they're trying to smooth its introduction, particularly to cheaper properties. And offsetting that are the big tax increases for multinational companies like Google, banks who can't offset losses anymore, and non-dom rich people, rich foreigners who live in Britain. And that raises a little bit more, they expect. So in total, they expect this statement to raise a little bit of money in the hundreds of millions, 300, 400, 500 million per year. But that's really tiny compared with the forecasting changes in this statement, because we see that tax
There's some big changes in numbers, aren't there?
Massive changes. So a few years out, they're expecting tax revenues overall to be 20 or 23 billion pounds lower than they previously expected as recently as March. Then offsetting that, they're expecting public spending to be up to 20 billion pounds lower. Mostly, it appears, from government debt interest, which appears to be mostly a technical change relating to the fact the Office for Budget Responsibility no longer assumes the Bank of England will sell the gilts it owns. Quite exactly how you get 19 billion pounds out of that sort of gimmick, I don't know yet, but we will be finding out this afternoon.
A bit more magic from the Chancellor. And Janan, those targets for big tax rises, banks, rich people, expats, it sounds like George Osborne might be thinking of an election there.
Well, the clearest example of that is actually the final tax increase he announced, which was for stamp duty on properties worth about 970 grand, which is a pretty substantial tax rise for people in London and the home counties, or a lot of them. And it's also aimed at neutering Labour's own mansion tax, which it announced quite recently, and which has proven to be more politically saleable than the Tories initially expected. What the Tories have done this time is a different version of what they almost did 2 years ago in the budget. They flirted with the idea of a mansion tax back then. David Cameron, the Prime Minister, relented at the last minute, and they've gone ahead with a modified version of it. And the advantage they'll claim is that actually this is a tax at the point of sale and not a kind of annual levy paid by grannies who are asset rich but cash poor. So there's political calculation as far as that goes. But I think the broader message was stay on course for prosperity, almost an exact word-for-word rip-off of John Key's election message in New Zealand a few years ago. Incumbent governments can only play one of two messages at an election. They can either say things are going so well, do the sensible thing, voters, and give us another term, which is what Margaret Thatcher did in 1987. Or they can say, yes, our record is mixed, the national mood is ambiguous, but we're making progress, and that progress would be endangered by the opposition, which is what Tony Blair did in 2005. George Osborne would have preferred to have run the first type of election campaign, but he hasn't got enough deficit progress to boast about. He's got a decent economic performance to boast about, and so he's playing a 2005 Blair style of election.
I mean, do you think the voters will buy this, Janan? Because the Tories have still got this image as the party of the rich, the people who don't care about the poor. I mean, do you think the things he's done today will help to change that?
Well, in that second type of election campaign I mentioned, a lot relies on the weakness of your opponents, and he's fortunate enough that Labour's reputation on economic competence and also the perceived leadership strength of Ed Miliband versus David Cameron, those are sufficient disadvantages for Labour that I think he could probably just about get away with this. Were Labour in a stronger position, had Labour addressed some of the questions about their own fiscal credibility years ago at the beginning of this Parliament, then I think he'd find it much tougher to get away with his record on cutting the deficit, and he'd be entirely reliant on Cameron's strength as a leader and the relatively decent economic performance in GDP growth that we have now.
And Chris, I noticed early in the speech the Chancellor was talking again, repeating the Prime Minister's warning about warning lights flashing on the dashboard of the global economy, hinting at trouble ahead. How big is the risk that he's going to have to come back and revise down these growth forecasts again in a year or two?
Quite possibly in a year or two. The growth forecasts won't look what they look like now, and these deficit forecasts, they change a lot. I think he's going to get through to the next election. I think, Janan, this is the last big moment. He'll get through to March, where he has to present the last forecasts. Things won't change that much unless we had some sort of crisis which we can't predict, and it doesn't look like we're going to have one. So no one can say this has been a wonderful vintage 5 years performance for the British economy, but the more important question is, could it have been much better? And I think he will be able to probably say, it hasn't been that great, but actually, would the other lot have done better? And I think that would be the argument.
What do we think are the biggest risks ahead, Chris?
Well, the biggest risks ahead in the public finances is that we get more of the same. So we get more bad news on revenues, and we don't then have something we can pull out of the bag, like a change in assumptions, which gives you £20 billion a year to make things look okay.
And Janan, finally from you, on the bookies have got Ed Balls as marginally the favourite to make the next speech as Chancellor. What's your feeling about that?
It's the hardest election to predict since, I think, the mid-70s. In 74 there were 2 elections. Harder even to predict than last time, which was a hung parliament. My hunch is, in some form or another, David Cameron will remain Prime Minister. The next big autumn statement will be delivered by George Osborne, either as a minority Tory government or as a renewed Lib-Con coalition.
Janan, Chris, thank you very much. You can continue to follow the FT's coverage of the autumn statement on our website at ft.com/autumn statement.